Today, Dr. Collini will speak on not justifying humanities.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody.
Attempts to extend and deepen our understanding of the human past, or to probe and analyze some of the profoundest puzzles of existence, or to sharpen and enrich our appreciation of literary and other artistic creations, these are self-evidently interesting and worthwhile activities. Nothing is gained by pretending that we think they are in some way unintelligible or alien or worthless activities. We can, if we wish, affect to take the role of the village reductionist and pretend to believe that the only indisputably legitimate activities are those that put food in the stomach or shelter over the head or money in the bank. But it's not a pose we can sustain for long. It soon becomes evident that we have minds and thoughts and reflections and curiosity, and therefore that we're sucked into the kinds of activities that I mentioned in my opening sentence. Now, of course, not everyone does everything all the time, nor does each of us do our chosen activities with the same degree of intensity or perseverance or ability. But there is nothing remotely puzzling in the idea that some people will wish to attend to some of these things some of the time. And in support of that truth, we might mention that there is a very long, rich, and well-documented history of human beings doing just that. What can it mean, therefore, to be asked to justify these activities? What are the values or lemmas that could count as providing a justification for these fundamental human enterprises? And focusing on this occasion, do they need to be justified to you or to me? I begin like this because we all know that discussion about the humanities in contemporary society are implicitly or explicitly driven by the felt need to find justifications for doing them. It would be silly to deny that there are social, cultural, and financial pressures that encourage this quest. I take those pressures seriously, and I believe that as academics in these disciplines, we cannot simply ignore them. But that, I think, makes it all the more important to identify clearly what the terms of the questions are and what could count as persuasive answers for which particular audiences. Almost any event with the humanities in its title risks, I think, seeming both predictable and depressing. Predictable because we suspect that after running through various travails and accusations, the humanities will by the end emerge in their full redemptive glory as the indispensable means of living a satisfactory human life. And of course, as the grand and pious adjectives build up, we find it hard to suppress a yawn, I think. But depressing because despite the inevitable arrival of the deepest human values cavalry to save the day at the end, the story along the way is always one of being beleaguered and besieged, involving a tone that varies somewhere between the self-justifying and the complaining. Now, as Anders said this morning, we should not encourage this tone, and I entirely agree. And so I'm going to take a rather quizzical look, both at the activity of justifying and, perhaps more provokingly, at the very category of the humanities itself. And I'll then quickly suggest one or two ways of engaging in this public discourse that may be a little less defensive and a little more specific. Obviously, the greater part of my own direct experience relates to the situation in Britain, and I'm not presuming that this applies in any simple way to the very different public debates in other societies. But there are, of course, some trends and elements which are common across our societies, and some of the things that are happening in Britain are, I'm sorry to tell you, things that if they haven't happened to you already are going to happen very soon. British universities, my favourite metaphor, are rather like the canary in the mine. If you're familiar with that metaphor, the canary is the bird which tells you when the breathing in the mine is starting to get dangerous and it's time to get out. And I have to say, if British universities are the canary in the mine, the canary is looking extremely sickly at the moment. Now, I think we might begin by acknowledging that at present, books and essays justifying the value of the humanities are largely read by those who believe in the case already. There can be, I think, a value in animating and fortifying our beliefs that we may otherwise take for granted or lose confidence in. But it should be clear that we're not principally being asked to justify to each other the interestingness or worthwhileness of the study and teaching of the humanities disciplines. Rather, we're being asked to make a case in response to a set of more limited and practical questions, perhaps about courses of study, numbers of students, types of research, and above all, of course, the expenditure of public money. But once we recognize that, I think we can see first that the cases we make will have to be entirely context-dependent, and at a much lower level of abstraction. And secondly, that the humanities may not be the most useful category to employ here. Let me start with a very obvious point about justification and how justification is in practice highly context-dependent. It depends first on the kind of criticism or skepticism which is being responded to, or at least anticipated. And second, it always depends upon being able to establish some commonality of values somewhere, some bridgehead in even the most hostile critics' assumptions, if the attempt at justification is to gain any purchase at all. For these reasons, it doesn't seem to me very helpful to try to develop some all-purpose justification couched in highly abstract terms. It may be better to think of particular forms of resistance we want to overcome on the part of particular publics, often in comparison to particular other preferred activities or purposes. And this means that the form and argumentative strategy of our exercises in characterization and persuasion need to be tailored accordingly. The relevant publics may, as we know, include various categories: legislators, parents, foundation administrators, journalists, schoolchildren, colleagues, donors, government officials, students, taxpayers. And of course, any actual individual may belong to more than one of those categories. Quite a lot of the well-meaning statements that are issued about the humanities tend to reduce to a series of abstract nouns in which imagination, empathy, and so on, all the usual suspects invariably figure. Now, justification at this level of abstraction may have its uses, but one obvious weakness of this strategy is that it's fatally easy for any interlocutors to enthusiastically concur with these large-sounding claims while not actually being persuaded about or conceding anything to the more local or institutional or financial case that the claims are meant to support. Government ministers, for example, can all too easily endorse grand statements about the value of the humanities in affirming our sense of the human, while simultaneously imposing large budget cuts on humanities funding. Another, perhaps slightly less obvious weakness is that such high-flown claims don't seem to entail the array of often knotty, detailed, and usually empirical inquiries that make up the actual daily practices of scholars in our various disciplines. And this is another point in which I concur with Onora. The most elevated claims for the humanities end up sounding as though their goals could be met if everyone would just spend their time reading the Odyssey and King Lear with an open heart. But not only is that kind of thing too general to be useful in most actual situations where persuasion is needed, but also it doesn't come close to focusing on what most scholars in the humanities disciplines actually do most of the time. Turning to the category of the humanities itself, the first thing to say is obviously this is chiefly an organizational or classifying term. But that, of course, may be one reason why it would be a mistake to be too essentialist about it. We should certainly not speak as though it were a timeless category, in my view. Not only is it a term that did not come into general currency in this modern sense in English until the mid-20th century, but it did so largely by way of reaction to the imperial claims of the methodological positivism of the 1930s and 1940s, as supposedly embodied in the natural and the social sciences. And perhaps it's never quite shaken off the aura of conservatism and defensiveness that were inherited from these origins. And it seems to me important not to endorse either of those associations. I should just add that although the term has been well established in Britain for some decades, I think it's fair to say that the discourse about the humanities has had and continues to have a particularly intimate connection with the characteristically American conception of a liberal arts education, chiefly made up of elective courses. And indeed, some of you may know that Jeffrey Harpham and other commentators have recently made the case that the very category of the humanities is intimately bound up with a particular educational version of the American dream. And secondly, even in the present, the increased use of this English language label, I do think, risks importing a false universality. Not only, as we've already heard earlier this morning, is the term not native to various other cultural traditions, it's not, after all, identical to les sciences humaines or the Geisteswissenschaften. But I think its overconfident use also conceals wide variations in institutional arrangements. And since I'm addressing questions of practical debate, those variations in institutional arrangements can be highly consequential. Sometimes, for example, history is placed among the social sciences, sometimes not. Sometimes art and music are placed in art schools and conservatoires, or sometimes separately classed as creative or performing arts, separate from the humanities. Sometimes religious studies are included, sometimes they're the preserve of divinity schools and seminaries. Sometimes linguistics or the more cultural aspects of sociology and anthropology are included, and sometimes they are firmly identified as social sciences. And even philosophy's membership of the club is sometimes questioned in institutional arrangements, especially those aspects of philosophy which are closer to logic or mathematics and far removed from the records of human activities, and so on. These classifications vary even across the English-speaking world, and even more across cultures with different intellectual traditions and educational arrangements. And a third reason to be careful about too readily using the category of the humanities is the risk that we may inadvertently reinstate some version of the supposed two cultures divide. For many intellectual and practical purposes, it seems to me a mistake to speak as though there were some clear-cut and exhaustive divide between the humanities and natural sciences, and not only for the reasons that Honora eloquently expressed this morning. Great swathes of work in all disciplines are broadly analytical and factual in similar ways, where standards of accuracy, rigor, and evidence are closely related. And what all the disciplines share is at least as important as what differentiates them. And they all have much to gain by articulating their common interest in the university as an enterprise devoted principally to the extension and deepening of human understanding. And fourth, another way in which treating the humanities as a single intellectual enterprise risks misleading us is that it almost always ends up focusing on the great books, and usually, therefore, reducing our diverse disciplines to the study of a few classics of literature and philosophy. But even in literature and philosophy, and still more in other fields, most scholars most of the time are not reading the great books, but are engaged in some much more analytical or empirical inquiries concentrated on particular times and places. And I think our account of the humanities disciplines should reflect this. The scholar who is attempting to decipher the fragmentary shards left by a now extinct civilization, or the scholar who is using parish registers to work out typical household structure in 17th century Europe, or the scholar who is charting the representation of gender roles in recent Latin American films, these are more representative of actual practice in our disciplines, and our descriptions should be tailored to reflect this. So constantly emphasizing the category of the humanities doesn't just operate at too high a level of abstraction for many purposes. By flattening out the distinctiveness of individual disciplines, it also tends to lose what may be most impressive and persuasive about a good piece of work in, say, ancient history or Renaissance musicology or criticism of the 19th century Russian novel and so on. Individual disciplines, after all, are not merely accidents of institutional arrangements or history. There are long and rich cultural traditions behind thinking about literature or religion or art and so on, and I think we need to harness the strength of these traditions to support the standing of the current forms of these inquiries. So as a matter of tactics, it can often be more productive to try to illustrate what is valuable about work in, say, metaphysics in its terms, or literary criticism in its terms, or social history in its terms, and so on. And this may also help us not to be led into making exaggerated claims for the moral benefits of studying these disciplines. Some defenders of the humanities are, in my view, a little too prone to speak as though their study is bound to make us into morally superior beings, a claim which is surely vulnerable to some rather disturbing counter-evidence. So, instead of digging ourselves in behind a stockade of overambitious claims couched at too high a level of abstraction and delivered in a tone of defensiveness, it's usually better when identifying the character and role of these enterprises to start from some of the facts of our actual practice in our particular diverse disciplines and work up from there. Now, all those are offered as reasons for caution, perhaps even for skepticism, but let me also make two more positive points in this connection. First, as scholars, we do need to make a greater effort to try to provide politicians, officials, journalists, administrators, and other public figures with a usable set of descriptions of what we do. Note, I say descriptions, not justifications. But we should not get sucked into the trap of claiming that the main value of these activities lies in the indirect contribution they may make to economic growth. It's tempting to put a lot of our eggs in that basket when we're dealing directly with governments, because economic growth is the one goal which is assumed to have indisputable electoral legitimacy in market democracies. But there are two major risks here. First, there's the risk that in time, only those activities that can be shown to contribute in this way will come to be supported, excluding those that are harder to justify in these terms. And second, there's the risk that we ourselves come to inhabit this language, that we start to understand the value of what we do in these terms, and even start to choose our research projects or teaching approaches accordingly. If you think I'm exaggerating this risk, you should look at the effect of the impact requirement in the UK's research assessment exercise as an example of what happens if we allow an external vocabulary of justification to come to provide an internal criterion of quality. In that exercise, departments must demonstrate the non-economic impact, the non-academic impact, if only, if only, the non-academic impact of their research. And this then becomes a major determinant of the ranking assigned to the quality of that research, with the result that some scholars we are now seeing starting to choose to work on the kinds of topic that might generate evidence of the right kind of social and economic impact. My second point is that alarmism, defensiveness, and the alienation of public support are closely related. There are, as I've said, many publics, and we shouldn't underestimate the level of interest in and enthusiasm for work in humanities disciplines in various quarters of society. Among several of these publics, there is an instinctive recognition that unfettered intellectual inquiry is central to what universities are about, and that therefore there is potentially a much greater reservoir of interest in and latent appreciation of the work of universities than the narrow and instrumental official discourse about economic growth ever succeeds in tapping into. Moreover, the evidence from sources as diverse as literary festivals, TV documentaries, book sales, gallery visits, and so on, suggests that many people are already interested in questions about literature and history, philosophy and religion, art and music, so it should not be impossible to persuade some of them of the value of developing more systematic understanding in these areas. The best work in these disciplines does this brilliantly, I think, and we should not sell such work short by misrepresenting it as an indirect way of developing commercially useful skills. If we do, we're getting ourselves into the absurd position of justifying learning to play Beethoven's piano sonatas on the grounds that it helps to make us better typists. Everything I've talked about so far deals with questions of argument, presentation, and persuasion. I want now to turn to a different level of analysis, but one which I believe supports my skeptical conclusions about the value of such large justifications for the humanities, which are couched in overly abstract terms. I want to look at some facts concerning the position of humanities disciplines in universities in Europe and the United States over the past 2 or 3 generations. And we may begin with the question of student enrollments, that is, the choices that applicants and then undergraduates make about which course of study to follow. There's recently been a lot of good research done on this by historians such as Roger Geiger in the USA and Peter Mandler in Britain. And their research shows that despite repeated alarms about an alleged crisis in the humanities, student numbers in humanities disciplines did not, in fact, show any catastrophic decline in the years between about 1945 and about 2010. If anything, the reverse was the case, although actually there were many local variations. They suggest several factors contributed to this. One was the increasing feminization of the student body over these years, with female students slightly more likely than males to choose humanities subjects, especially languages, literature, and art. Another enormously important factor was the perception that employers believed a good education in humanities subject was a suitable preparation for the forms of employment in which they were trying to recruit. This was not a straightforward matter, and in some cases the perception may not have corresponded to the reality. But as long as students believed that they would not be penalized in the job market for having studied humanities subjects, then the enrollment numbers held up. And a third big determinant was what happened in schools. Some of the major disciplines, such as history and literature, have been central to secondary school education across these decades, and that encouraged numbers of students to continue to study these subjects at university. We can see how decisive this factor can be when we look at the decision of the British government in the early 2000s to make the study of a modern foreign language no longer compulsory in secondary education. This had a dramatic effect on numbers choosing to do degrees in modern languages, to the extent that the university-level study of literature in all European languages other than French and Spanish is now at risk of almost dying out, though there are, of course, also longer-term cultural causes for their shrinkage. There are some broad patterns also common to most European and European-influenced societies where the expansion of higher education is concerned in the second half of the 20th century. One common feature is that new institutions that were founded in these years with the intention of developing a new educational model increasingly came to imitate the dominant established models. Up until at least the 1980s or 1990s, this tended to favor humanities disciplines because they were seen to be one of the defining characteristics of the traditional institutions. And another common feature is that the first phases of this expansion of student numbers, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, largely increased the recruitment from the same advantaged sections of society. The most significant change in those years was the big increase in the numbers of daughters as well as sons of the middle class who went into higher education, another development which, as I mentioned, somewhat favored humanities disciplines, or at least some of them. Recruitment on a large scale from the less privileged social strata only really started to happen in most countries in the 1990s and 2000s. Now, if the pattern of student enrollment was broadly positive for the humanities up until at least 2000, 2010, wherever the recent studies stop, it may be that we've been starting to see a change over the past 6 or 7 years, though it's rather early to say how marked or how permanent may be an apparent decline in numbers of humanities students. But here, too, scholarly research offers some useful, longer perspectives. There is, for example, some evidence to suggest that the higher the proportion of the age cohort that is enrolled in higher education in any given country, the lower the proportion studying humanities subjects will be. Moreover, the figures suggest that the higher concentration of humanities students will tend to be found in the most selective institutions, even if lower status institutions offer the same range of subjects. Now, many elements may come into play here, including that students from more privileged backgrounds are more likely to see a degree in the humanities subjects as the consolidation of advantages in terms of cultural capital, whereas those from social strata new to higher education are more likely to be anxious that they will need relevant expert qualifications for the job market if they're to compensate for having attended less highly regarded universities. Interestingly, by the way, in the UK, the evidence still suggests that the top employers are more influenced by the perceived standing of the university that job applicants attended than by the subject they studied. A tendency, again, that may work to the advantage of humanities subjects, at least in so-called elite institutions, while of course it also tends to reproduce social advantage. Indeed, a more specific worry that we might have in this connection at present is that students, and eventually scholars, in many of these disciplines are likely to be increasingly recruited from the offspring of the privileged classes. This is already true to a considerable extent of disciplines such as art history and classics in Britain, and is becoming true of modern languages. But overall, the point to emphasize here is that the evidence does not suggest that student enrollment is at all responsive to large-scale statements about the value of the humanities, but rather that it's determined by a range of more substantial social and economic factors, as I think we might expect. In 1964, a once celebrated book was published, which was alluded to earlier, entitled Crisis in the Humanities, in which the distinguished contributors announced that these disciplines faced extinction unless they radically mended their ways. In practice, this announcement of a near-terminal crisis roughly coincided with one of the largest expansions of numbers of both scholars and students in the humanities there has ever been. So perhaps we should not exaggerate the causal role of such pronouncements. Taking a wider perspective still, we shall of course hear more in the immediate future about the need for a global view, though it's important to recognize that the relation of many humanities disciplines to their native cultures will always remain more intimate than for other disciplines. Most work in the natural sciences, and even in many of the social sciences, can be pursued anywhere, and in a global economy will, by and large, be pursued where funding dictates. But the study and teaching of, say, Danish history is always likely to be particularly pursued in Denmark, or Portuguese literature in Portugal, and so on. And that should be a reminder from another angle that these inquiries are more continuous with interests and debates in the wider non-academic culture of which they are a part. The future of, for example, art history will be considerably affected by what happens to galleries and collections. The future of the study of literature by what happens to literary publishing and literary journalism, and so on. A narrow focus on funding policies for undergraduate education risks losing sight of some of the forces that give these subjects their vitality and their wider appeal in particular cultures. Looking to the future, my guess is that in terms of numbers, both of students and staff, and in terms of their influence on decisions about processes and structures, the humanities disciplines are likely to be a more reduced presence in higher education systems in, say, 2050 and beyond, where they may largely come to be confined to the major research universities and the more elite colleges in many cases. Certainly, they will not again have, I think, the centrality they had in the middle decades of the 20th century. In Britain, but not of course in Britain alone, business and management studies is now the single most popular subject at undergraduate level, which obviously reflects wider changes in society over the past 2 or 3 decades, and there's every reason to think that those changes will continue in the immediate future. It's also the case that the democratization of higher education in most countries has seen the traditional academic subjects, whether in the humanities or, interestingly, in the natural sciences, becoming less popular among the social groups now entering higher education for the first time. And the decline in the position of such disciplines in the newer institutions that primarily cater to these groups is particularly marked. But nothing is forever. 150 years ago, many would have found it unthinkable that the classics could ever lose its dominant place in education, and some would have regarded such a prospect as the end of civilization. Well, something is now rather similarly being said about other humanities subjects, and I don't think we should encourage such apocalyptic or alarmist talk. Outstanding scholarship in these disciplines will continue to be published, whatever published comes to mean, and there will still be substantial demand for courses in them. We should not regard the mere fact that a smaller proportion of students may take courses in the humanities as spelling disaster. The shifting proportions are, after all, reflective of deeper changes in the character of our societies, and humanities should certainly not be positioned as attempting to resist all such changes. The contemporary political expression of some of these changes is another matter. At present, we may be witnessing the shift from the university as shaped by the social democratic era to the university as reflecting the era of the politics of market individualism. From the mid-19th through to the late 20th century, one of the notable achievements of European and European-influenced societies was the way they managed to adapt the attenuated traditions of their originally few and rather marginal institutions of higher learning to turn them into powerhouses of culture. And the humanities disciplines prospered accordingly. Both aristocratic and social democratic values in turn contributed to that transformation. But from at least the 1980s onwards, other values have been more dominant and are in the process of reshaping universities in their own image. In these circumstances, it would be unrealistic to expect the humanities disciplines to be able to continue to benefit from the older kind of deference to the ideals of culture. Debates on the theme of the place or nature or value or future of the humanities are one name we give to our anxieties about this transition. But, and this is my concluding point, but we should not let these political pressures drive us into misdescribing the purpose of learning more about history or literature or philosophy or other subjects. And this is one of the places where I do think the logic of justification can sometimes lead us astray. As I said, there's a tendency for defenders of universities in general, and the humanities in particular, to want to present them as contributing to every approved social good. This seems to me a mistake, both as a matter of fact and as a matter of tactics. We may believe that social mobility, whatever we think that means, is a good thing, and we may believe that respecting the views of less privileged groups, whatever we think that means, is also a good thing. But we would be foolish to try to justify the study of the humanities in terms of these larger social goals, which can at best be byproducts of the work of a university, not its defining aim. We may certainly hope that in helping to extend cultural understanding, we are not narrowing human sympathies, but there may be no necessary connection in either direction. As I hinted earlier, almost all arguments that seem to suggest that scholarship, science, or culture turn their practitioners into better people are awkwardly vulnerable to counterexamples. Just think of the members of any typical university department. The fact that someone can make a dazzling breakthrough in the understanding of human behavior while at the same time behaving abominably in other aspects of life and holding deplorable political views may make us uncomfortable. But it is a combination that universities have to live with because such extension of understanding is their primary activity, not the manufacturing of right-mindedness. To avoid misunderstanding, let me repeat that I believe it is very important that historians try to demonstrate to wider audiences something of the appeal and interest of the best work in history, that scholars of literature do this for literary studies, philosophers for philosophy, and so on. I would urge that as scholars and teachers, we need to do more of this, not less. But well-meant official statements by those representing universities that attempt to justify these disciplines on the grounds that they're an excellent preparation for becoming a corporate executive or hedge fund manager I don't make those up, by the way, or on the grounds that through the culture industries they help to boost GDP, risk undermining rather than strengthening our position. Rather than falling into this trap, it may be better to acknowledge that there are limits to how successfully we can persuade certain sections of the political and media worlds about the value of what we do. And at those moments, it's important to remember the plurality of publics, because there are others upon whom our arguments may have more persuasive effects. The truth is, surely, that the humanities form a relatively small part of the modern research university, but they bulk very large in all discussions about the idea or future of universities. And this may not simply be because those who dilate on these matters are drawn disproportionately from humanities disciplines. It may in part be because the discourse about the humanities has become a locus and in some respects a placeholder for wider anxieties about the changing relations between culture and democracy, between society and economy. These anxieties have real objects, as well as, like all anxieties, their exaggerated or phantasmatic features. But in these brief remarks, I've tried not to encourage this only partly conscious use of the category of the humanities as a way of addressing these wider issues, not least because it tends to make so much of the discourse about the humanities simultaneously too defensive and too pious. We have good reason, in my view, to be more modest. But then, I think, we have every reason also to be more confident. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Collini. So be militant, but be modest. As for questions, if I could ask people to stand up and speak their name before they ask a question. We have time for a few. Yes?
My name is Carlsberg. So I wondered, the story you told is a very British story. And I wondered how much it fits the global development. And one of the things, of course, that fits with the proportion that we have had all over the world the last 25 years or so, an explosive expansion of universities in general, and enrollment in universities in general. We're talking countries going from 3% to 50%, or here 30% to 80%. So we have had an expansion, a huge amount of expansion in universities around the world. And that has led to, of course, most of those students take other kind of degrees than humanities degrees. But it's also led to a huge expansion of the humanities globally and to liberal arts education globally. So rather than seeing a situation where it shrinks, you have a situation where you have an explosion of interesting liberal arts colleges around the world. All of Hong Kong just changed to from a 3 to a 4-year model. Fudan introduced liberal arts education, Alaquan in Morocco, Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. So you see an expansion of this kind of model around the world, which also fits the kind of neoliberal American version of the American dream.
American dream. Yes. Well, of course, what you say about expansion is absolutely true. The phrase of mine that I think you were alluding to did say that I think what we are seeing is a decline in the proportion of students who do the humanities. That may mean that the numbers, and especially if you include countries which previously had rather few students in higher education at all, have so expanded. If you include numbers, of course the numbers have grown globally very considerably. I think we have to be a little careful here. This is, again, where the category of the humanities can be a little misleading. I mean, what it seems to me from my reading, I do work a fair bit on the comparative history of universities in the recent decades. What I think it suggests often is that what get classed in the official statistics as humanities disciplines are a kind of service discipline very often. That is to say, teaching of modern languages for business studies, where far from there being actually literary or historical scholars. There are people who are language teachers, and we have to decide where we think that belongs in our classifications and so on. But I do think one of the interesting developments that other people other than me have already pointed to in relation to these debates is that China, having expanded its university system so prodigiously in the last generation, dwarfing every other scale of expansion across the world, and having initially invested so much in technological, principally, and then to some extent business and legal education, are now emphasizing the role of the humanities for various purposes. Now, quite what this will come to be, I think it's a bit too early to say, but I do think it's one of the cases where a perception that if you are to engage with elsewhere in the world, you need a certain cultural sensitivity to what goes on in the world, and therefore an understanding of different cultural traditions comes into play. So I didn't mean to suggest, if your question implies this, but forgive me if it didn't, but I didn't mean to suggest that I think the whole thing's coming to an end, or that the whole thing is shrinking irreparably, but that I think, as I said, the evidence is where the higher proportion of a population go into higher education, the humanities will be a lower proportion of the student enrollment.
We have time for one more question. Yes?
I enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you.
And part of my question was about, so I take you to say that we should be modest and we should live with the fact that that might mean that the humanities disciplines become smaller, more quality, maybe less quantity, or maybe something that belongs more in elite institutions. And one of my other questions was actually, would you say that, say you take a degree in philosophy in University of Sunderland, I don't even know if you can actually still do that, but if you did that and then you took a degree at Oxford, would that actually be the same degrees? And that relates to another thing that I found fascinating that you said, which is this thing about how humanities are so linked to the national context. And particularly, I mean, if we look at the British rise in management education, obviously it's a money-making machine. So all universities have to have a management or business school, attract foreign students and earn money on that business model. We don't have that in Denmark at all. There's a lot of reasons for that. But wouldn't it be true to say it in the same way that in that regard, humanities simply isn't the same type of subject as business and management like science, because that can be taught on a global market for education, whereas humanities have this much more culturally rooted content. That means that we can't make the same sort of industrial production of higher education.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, there are quite a few questions rolled together there.
Perhaps a shortish answer.
I'll give an answer which is proportional to your questions. Let me make very clear, by the way, that I was deploring, not recommending, the fact that these subjects may turn out to be increasingly restricted to elite educational institutions. It's clearly happening by social selection already, and I don't think we should encourage that. I think it's quite true that the incidence of business studies varies, including, of course, whether it's an undergraduate or professional school course. The impact of American business schools, which have led the way here, is predicated within the United States system on doing an undergraduate liberal arts degree. That's not replicated everywhere else, and so the expansion of business is often at the expense of the humanities subjects rather than building on the top of them. When you said, did I think we should content ourselves with being more modest? Well, more modest in terms of not pitching for such exaggerated benefits to assumedly flow from the humanities that we make the case implausible, yes, but not more modest in thinking that the quality of work that gets done in any given discipline should be in any way underplayed. I mentioned the classics, which have changed their place in higher educational systems dramatically over the last century and a half, but actually some of the most brilliant work done at the moment is done in classics departments, which bring together philosophers, archaeologists, literary scholars, historians, and so on at a very high level of proficiency, and who have become very good at making their case to wider publics, including through television and other kinds of publication and so on, in a way that is not always true of subjects which have had an easier time of it. precisely because they have been reduced, they have been aware earlier than many of us, I think, of the need to make that case and make it interesting to the next generation. So in being more modest, it's the opposite, I think, of being more passive. It's just accepting the reality of the situation we're in.
Thank you, Professor Collini.